The following content may include discussions or topics that could be triggering or upsetting to individuals who have experienced similar traumas. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hi, I'm Sandy McKenna, and along with Abraham Ulrich, welcome to the Sins of Scientology. It is so hard to believe that we've reached the end of this intense and eye-opening season. As we dive into our final episode of this season, let's take a look back at the journey we've taken together. We began with Episode 1, the enigmatic L. Ron Hubbard, exploring the complex figure who laid the foundation for Scientology, setting the stage for everything else to come. In Episode 2, we trace the meteoric rise of David Miscavige and his rise to power, uncovering how he ascended to the helm and reshaped the organization's future.
From there, we move to one of the most pivotal stories in our series, The Takeover of Clearwater, a two-part deep dive into the town's transformation under Scientology's influence. Then came the harrowing story of Paulette Cooper, an episode dedicated to one journalist's terrifying ordeal, highlighting the length to which the church would go to silence critics. In Heber Jensch, A Tale of Faith, Power, and Betrayal, we saw how devotion and ambition could clash with devastating personal consequences. This led us to one of Scientology's most scandalous incidents, spiraling into darkness, the Lisa McPherson tragedy, a haunting three-part series that examined her life, struggles, and the troubling circumstances of her final days.
Episode 10, Scientology and Psychiatry, tackled the contentious and complex relationship between the church and mental health professionals, a conflict that paved the way for the shocking story of Jeremy Perkins, where mental illness, fate, and tragedy collided in ways we could hardly imagine.
Then we encountered the truth behind Narconon, the controversial rehab linked to Scientology, revealing a treatment program with practices as polarizing as the church itself. Afterwards, we took an even darker turn, stepping inside Scientology's secret prison, the dark truth of the RPF, uncovering hidden stories of confinement and control.
And finally, in the rise, fall, and legacy of David Mayo, we looked at one of Scientology's most notable figures, a man who influenced the church's core beliefs before becoming its outcast.
And today, we're closing out the season with an episode that pulls it all together, reflecting on the figures, stories, and insights that brought us here. Whether you've been with us since Episode 1 or joined us mid-season, we want to thank you for being part of this journey. Now let's dive in and see where this story takes us.
The summer of 1969 was supposed to be a time of peace, love, and a revolution, a cultural awakening defined by the music of Woodstock, the thrill of landing on the moon, and the dreams of a generation to change the world. But in Los Angeles, the season ended not in harmony, but in horror. A series of brutal murders so savage and random shattered the illusion of safety and sent the entire nation spiraling into fear. At the center of that terror was a man named Charles Manson, a drifter with a hypnotic gaze and a vision so twisted that he managed to convince a group of young, idealistic followers to become killers. Manson promised his followers love and enlightenment, but what he delivered was a prophecy of chaos he called Helter-Skelter, a delusional apocalyptic vision that ended in bloodshed. Tonight, on the season finale of Sins of Scientology, we unravel the chilling story of Manson and the cult-like hold he had over his family of followers. We'll take you inside the brutal nights on Cielo Drive and Waverly Drive, exploring how Manson turned love into fear and peace into violence. We'll examine how a man with no real power or wealth managed to become one of the most feared figures in the 20th century. We're also going to dive into Manson's brief but intriguing connection to Scientology and how certain psychological techniques may have inspired his own methods of control. But be warned, this is not just the story about murder. It is about the fragility of the human mind and how easily belief can be twisted into something monstrous. I'm Sandy McKenna, and along with my co-host, Abraham Ulrich, we peel back the layers of one of the most terrifying chapters in American history. This is the Sins of Scientology.
Charles Manson was born Charles Miles Maddox on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio. His mother, Kathleen Maddox, was only 16 years old, a troubled teenager herself, barely old enough to take care of the newborn she brought into the world. Kathleen, by all accounts, was a wayward spirit, often getting into scrapes with the law. She drank heavily and found herself entangled in relationships that were as chaotic as her own life. Charles' father, a transient man named Colonel Walker Henderson Scott Sr., was never present, abandoning Kathleen as soon as he learned of her pregnancy. With no father figure in sight and a mother whose presence was often overshadowed by her misadventures, Charles' early life was fraught with instability. The story of Charles Manson's childhood is a haunting portrait of neglect. Kathleen, after Manson was born, briefly married a man named William Manson, and it was from him that Charles would take the last name that would become infamous in American history. But the marriage was short-lived, and Kathleen's attempt to maintain any resemblance of a traditional family life unraveled quickly. By the time he was 5 years old, Charles was already witnessing the harsh realities of an unpredictable life. There are reports of Kathleen even attempting to trade young Charles for a pitcher of beer at a bar, an anecdote that became a grim symbol of the brokenness of his childhood. Though her attempts to relinquish him were unsuccessful, the damage was done. When Manson was 9 years old, Kathleen was arrested for armed robbery alongside her brother. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison, leaving Charles to bounce between various relatives and state institutions. During this time, he developed a sense of abandonment and mistrust, fostering a rebellious spirit that would only grow as he aged. His relatives were unable or unwilling to provide the emotional warmth he craved. Many of his caretakers found his behavior troublesome, but none could have foreseen the darkness that was slowly taking root in his young mind. At the age of 12, Manson was sent to the Gibbolt School of Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana, a reform school designed to rehabilitate wayward youth. The institution was meant to teach discipline and respect, but for Charles, it was a breeding ground of resentment. He ran away from school multiple times, often living on the streets or stealing to survive. By his teenage years, he had already begun to build a criminal record, which included theft, armed robbery, and other petty crimes. The state had a clear picture. This was a boy on a fast track to a life of crime. Manson's time in and out of juvenile facilities between ages 13 and 18 was marked by continuous turmoil. He was sent to the Indiana Boys' School, where he later claimed other inmates physically and sexually abused him. He learned quickly how to manipulate and survive in environments full of predators, skill that would later become his most dangerous weapon. At one point, he escaped the Indiana Boys' School and fled to his mother, hoping she would take him in. Instead, she rejected him, a moment that cut deep and left a mark of pain and betrayal he never forgot. Following the crushing moment, Manson drifted from one facility to another. In the late 1940s, he was transferred to the Natural Bridge Honor Camp, a minimum security institution in Virginia. But escape seemed to be the only thing on his mind. He attempted several more getaways, stealing cars, breaking into stores, and generally thumping his nose at any authority figure that tried to tame him. By the time he turned 18 in 1952, Manson had spent most of his adolescence in reform school, and any dream of a normal life were long gone. He was hardened, angry, and determined to never be the one left powerless again. Charles Manson had become a young man who knew how to use charm as a defense mechanism, manipulating people even then to get what he wanted. He has studied and absorbed the art of manipulation, understanding how to twist emotions and exploit the vulnerabilities of others. As he reached adulthood, Manson had already embraced a pattern of crime and coercion, setting the stage for the unsettling chapter that would follow in his life story. Manson's path to infamy was far from accidental. It was paved of neglect, abuse, and his own blossoming criminal ingenuity. This was the making of a man who would later capture the darkest recesses of America's imagination. His early years were the foundation on which he would build a house of horrors that no one would ever forget.
When Charles Manson arrived at McNeil Island Penitentiary in Washington in the early 1960s, he was already a hardened criminal, a man whose life had been shaped by years of incarceration, petty theft, and a growing obsession with power and control. He was in his late 20s, a young man deeply troubled who had spent more time in prison than in the outside world. The walls of McNeil Island had seen countless men come and go, but few would leave such a lasting and sinister legacy as Charles Manson. McNeil Island wasn't just a place of punishment, it was also kind of a place where you could learn. Inmates often had access to educational programs and, more importantly, to each other. The prison was a melting pot of ideas, schemes, and philosophies, and it was here, in this confined world of concrete and iron, that Manson's curiosity was piqued by a religion that was gaining popularity even among the incarcerated. It was Scientology. The 1960s were a time when people, even in prison, were searching for new paths to enlightenment, and Scientology was marked as just that, a way to unlock the human mind's full potential and free oneself from the chains of the past. Manson, always hungry for knowledge that could give him an edge, was immediately intrigued. Scientology seemed to offer something he had always craved, the promise of control, not just over himself, but potentially over others. He began to devour the teachings of L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, who had penned countless texts and self-help philosophies aimed at mastering the mind. Manson wasn't just a passive observer. He threw himself into the courses offered within the prison walls, attending auditing sessions and completing over 150 hours of training. Auditing in Scientology is a practice designed to help individuals confront and clear negative experiences, referred to as engrams, from their subconscious minds. In these sessions, an auditor guides the participant through past traumas, aiming to strip away emotional baggage and elevate them to a higher state of being. For Manson, these sessions were more than just spiritual exercises. They were a blueprint for manipulation. As he sat in those auditing rooms, Manson wasn't just seeking personal freedom. He was taking mental notes, observing how the process of questioning and confronting memories could make people feel vulnerable and open to suggestions. In his twisted mind, Manson saw an opportunity. He began to grasp how Scientology's techniques could be adapted for his own purposes. He watched as his fellow inmates seemed to open up, becoming pliable under the careful and methodical questioning of an auditor. If the mind could be unburdened and reshaped, Manson realized it could also be manipulated. Here was a man who had always felt powerless, and Scientology offered him a way to grasp a sense of control, even if only in theory. But in true Manson fashion, he grew disillusioned. The teachings of L. Ron Hubbard, with their promise of spiritual salvation, ultimately left him wanting more. Manson craved a deeper power, one that would not only change his inner self, but also allow him to dominate and influence those around him. He once reportedly dismissed Scientology, claiming it was inadequate for his needs, calling it a weak religion that failed to deliver the mastery he sought. For Manson, it wasn't enough just to clear his mind. He wanted to bend the minds of others to his will. Despite this disillusionment, his time spent with Scientology was not wasted. It added to the arsenal of psychological tricks and tools that he would later employ with deadly precision. He combined the concepts he had learned about probing the subconscious and breaking down emotional barriers with other philosophies and manipulative tactics that he picked up over the years. This confluence of ideas would form the bedrock of mind control techniques he later used to build and maintain his cult, the Manson Family. When he finally left McNeil Island Penitentiary in 1967, Manson was not just an ex-con with a guitar and a dream of becoming a rock star. He was now armed with a dangerous understanding of human psychology, a knowledge that would prove fatal in years to come. His time immersed in Scientology's practices may have been brief, but the impact was lasting, planting seeds of manipulation that would eventually bear the blood-stained fruit of one of America's most infamous crimes. Manson's brush with Scientology was just one chapter in a life marked by a quest for control, but it was a pivotal one. It was here that he began to fully understand the power of suggestions and the allure of spiritual promises, a knowledge that he would wield with devastating effect. As he prepared to step back into the outside world, Charles Manson was more than just a man. He was a ticking time bomb.
When we think of Charles Manson, one image often comes to mind, that wild-eyed, almost hypnotic stare. It was a look that could make your skin crawl, but for the members of his so-called Manson family, that stare and the man behind it yielded an unshakable power. How did he do it? How did a man who drifted from one prison to another come to command such absolute devotion from his followers? The answer lies in his mastery of psychological manipulation, a skill he honed in prison from various influences. Interestingly enough, Scientology. Manson's tactics were insidious and carefully crafted. At the heart of his control was the way he broke his followers' sense of self. He targeted vulnerable people, mostly young women who had been searching for a purpose or escape from their troubled past. He isolated them from their families, moved them into the seclusion of the Spahn ranch, and bombarded them with a mix of love and fear. One former member recalled, "He made you feel like you were the most special person in the world one moment, and the next, he teared you down until you didn't know which way was up. You lived for his approval and he knew it." Manson was a master of love bombing, a tactic seen in many cults. He would overwhelm new recruits with affection and promises of a utopian family where they would find acceptance. Then, he suddenly started to control their thoughts, often using a combination of sleep deprivation, repetitive messaging, and communal rituals that kept his followers in a heightened emotional state. He'd play the guitar and weave these hypnotic speeches about the apocalypse, about his twisted interpretation of the Beatles' Helter-Skelter, convincing his followers they were soldiers in a coming race war, that only he could guide them. And here's where the Scientology Connection gets interesting. While Manson wasn't a practicing Scientologist, when he formed the Manson family, some of his psychological control methods bear resemblance to the techniques he likely picked up during those 150 hours of auditing sessions at McNeil Island Penitentiary. The basic premise of auditing in Scientology is to dig deep into a person's traumas or engrams with the goal of freeing them from emotional pain. The auditor asks probing questions, often repeatedly, until the subject reveals deeply buried memories, making them vulnerable. Manson adapted this idea, but twisted into something far more sinister. Instead of helping his followers release their trauma, he used their confessions and vulnerabilities to control them. Former family members have said that Manson will conduct his own twisted form of auditing, asking deeply personal questions to expose their secrets. He then used this knowledge to bind them to him, constantly reminding them that he knew everything about them and that leaving or betraying him would be unthinkable. Cults often rely on a form of indoctrination that keeps members emotionally dependent and mentally exhausted, and Manson was no different. The parallels of Scientology's indoctrination, as some experts have noted, are striking. Dr. Stephen Hassan, a leading expert on cults, pointed out that both Scientology and the Manson family used a version of what's called thought reform. In this process, a person's critical thinking skills are systematically broken down through repetitive teachings and psychological pressure, leaving them open to new beliefs and directives. Manson's techniques, Hassan said in a 2018 interview, weren't as structured as Scientology's, but had the same goal: to create a sense of dependence and eliminate a person's ability to think independently. Former Scientologists have also weighed in on these similarities. One former member of the church who has since become a vocal critic made an observation. "When I look back at how Manson manipulated his followers, I can see elements of the auditing process. The idea of making someone relive their trauma over and over is a way to disarm them. Manson learned that in prison and used it to horrific effects." Manson's charisma was the final piece of the puzzle. He knew how to perform, how to draw people in with his magnetic charm and mask the darkness within. At Spahn Ranch, he was the messiah his followers believed in, a master illusionist who convinced them to see the world through his apocalyptic lens. He blended pieces of Scientology's mind control techniques, his own street-smart cunning, and the power of suggestion into a terrifying cocktail that left his followers spellbound.
Manson wasn't just a scruffy ex-con. He was a self-proclaimed guru, promising enlightenment to anyone willing to follow him. His charisma was magnetic. He had a hypnotic way of speaking, weaving together strands of mysticism, biblical prophecy, and his twisted interpretations of pop culture. He played the guitar like a shaman conducting a ritual, singing songs that seemed to speak to the souls of all those around him. His followers, many of them young women in their late teens and early 20s, hung on his every word. He had a knack for finding vulnerable ones, those who had run away from home, felt unloved, or were desperate for a father figure. To them, Manson offered unconditional acceptance. He gave them nicknames, made them feel special, and promised them a new family, one that would never judge or abandon them. In Charlie's world, one former member later said, it was like we were finally seen, finally loved. We were free to be whoever he wanted us to be. And that was the key. Manson's version of freedom was an illusion, a carefully orchestrated trap. As the family grew, Manson took them to the Spahn Ranch, a dusty, desolate movie set on the outskirts of Los Angeles. There he had complete control, and he wasted no time establishing himself as the ultimate authority. Manson framed the group as a family, with himself as a loving but stern father figure. But it wasn't just a family, it was a cult. And like any cult leader, Manson relied on psychological tactics to maintain his iron grip on his followers. One of his most powerful tools was isolation. By cutting off his followers from the outside world, both physically and emotionally, Manson ensured that he was the only voice they heard. He made sure they abandoned their pasts, their parents, and any connection to the lives they once knew. He kept them busy with manual labor, endless rituals, and constant group activities, leaving little time to think critically or question his authority. Anything sound familiar? Manson used sleep deprivation as a method of control, keeping the family up all night with endless monologues and music sessions, bringing down their resistance and making them more pliable. He also practiced something that had parallels to Scientology's auditing process, where deep probing questions are used to uncover and manipulate a person's innermost fears and desires. But Manson's version was twisted. He'd gather his followers around him and make them spill their secrets, digging into their traumas and using that knowledge to bind them to him. If anyone dared to think about leaving, he'd remind them of what he knew, of the pain he could inflict, not just emotionally but physically. Obedience was absolute. Manson broke down personal barriers by mixing love and violence. He'd shower his followers with affection one moment and berate them viciously the next. This emotional roller coaster created a trauma bond, a psychological trap where his followers were dependent on him for both their validation and their survival. And in Manson's world, love was something he controlled, something he doled out, or withheld like a drug. It's here in Manson's tactics that we see echoes of other cult control methods, including those practiced in Scientology. Just like L. Ron Hubbard's teachings, Manson's manipulations revolved around stripping down an individual's identity and rebuilding it in his image. He used repetition, thought reform, and the dismantling of critical thinking skills to create followers who were utterly devoted to his vision. But while Scientology might promise spiritual enlightenment, Manson's teachings led only to destruction. Psychologist Margaret Singer, who studied cult behaviors extensively, once explained, cults work by taking away an individual's ability to reason and replacing it with a singular belief system. In Manson's case, he didn't need sophistication. He used a chaotic mix of love, fear, and dependency to turn his followers into instruments of his own delusions. And so, at the Spahn Ranch, what started as a dream utopia became a nightmare. Manson, the self-styled messiah, had built his cult of personality with tools that were disturbingly effective, even if they were borrowed and distorted from philosophies he'd encountered during his prison years. And in the end, his family was loyal, terrifyingly, tragically loyal, and ready to do whatever he commanded.
When we hear about the horrors of the Tate and LaBianca murders, our focus often lands on Charles Manson, the cult leader with wild eyes and a messianic complex. But Manson wasn't the one yielding the knife or pulling the trigger. The gruesome murders were carried out by members of his so-called family, young men and women whose lives had spiraled into Manson's orbit, drawn by his dark charisma and manipulative promises of love, acceptance, and a new way of life. To understand how these seemingly ordinary young people became murderers, we have to look back at who they were before Manson got his hooks into them. Susan Atkins, often remembered for her chilling role in the murders, was born on May 7, 1948, in San Gabriel, California. Her early life was marked by chaos and heartbreak. Her mother passed away from cancer when Susan was just 15, and her family fell apart soon after. Her father, who had struggled with alcoholism, couldn't hold the family together, and Susan ended up living with relatives. By the time she was in her late teens, she was lost, drifted, and desperate for a place to belong. Susan eventually made her way to San Francisco, where the Haight-Ashbury district was the mecca of counterculture youth. It was there in 1967 that she met Charles Manson. Manson promised her the love and family she craved since her mother's death. He renamed her Sadie Mae Glutz and convinced her she was part of a spiritual revolution. Susan, eager to be loved and accepted, became one of Manson's most devoted followers, willing to do anything he asked, even murder. Patricia Krenwinkel, born on December 3, 1947, in Los Angeles, had a childhood that many would describe as ordinary but deeply troubled beneath the surface. Her parents divorced when she was a teenager, and she struggled with feelings of inadequacy and body image issues. Patricia never felt like she fit in, often describing herself as an outsider. After high school, she worked as a secretary and lived a quiet, unfulfilled life. It wasn't until she met Charles Manson at a friend's house that she felt a spark of belonging. Manson told Patricia she was beautiful, something she had rarely heard, and that she could be free from societal constraints. She fell under his spell, captivated by his promises of love in a utopian family. Patricia left her old life behind and joined the Manson family, where she became known as Katie. The soft-spoken young woman soon found herself committing unimaginable acts of violence, all in service of the man she believed was a messiah. Leslie Van Houten, the youngest of the Manson murderers, was born on August 23, 1949, in Altadena, California. Her early years were marked by privilege and opportunity, growing up in a middle-class family with seemingly every advantage. But when her parents divorced when she was 14, Leslie's life began to unravel. She started using drugs, experimenting with LSD and other hallucinogens. By her late teens, she had become a free spirit, drifting through California's counterculture scene. At just 19 years old, Leslie encountered the Manson family and was seduced by the promise of a communal lifestyle where everyone was equal and love was abundant. Manson played on her vulnerabilities and spiritual curiosity, telling her that she could help change the world. It didn't take long for Leslie to fall completely under his spell, believing in his apocalyptic visions. On the night of the LaBianca murderers, Leslie went from being a hopeless young woman to a murderer, her hands stained with the blood of innocent people. Charles Tex Watson was the all-American boy turned killer, a former high school football star from Coalville, Texas, born on December 3, 1945. Watson seemed to have a bright future ahead of him. He attended the University of North Texas, but quickly grew restless and disillusioned with the straight-laced life his family envisioned for him. Like so many young people of his generation, he drifted west to California, seeking freedom and excitement. It was in Los Angeles that Tex Watson met Charles Manson. Manson's teachings about the end of the world and the need to prepare for the coming race war captivated Tex. He became Manson's right-hand man, the muscle behind the madness. Manson's influence over Tex was profound, convincing the former athlete to abandon his past and fully embrace the violent chaos Manson preached. On the night of the murderers, Tex led the charge, carrying out Manson's orders with a cold and terrifying efficiency. Linda Kasabian was born on June 21, 1949, in Bedford, Maine. Linda had a tumultuous childhood marked by her parents' divorce and a troubled adolescence. She married young, had a child, and found herself drifting, drawn to the West Coast in search of peace and meaning. Linda was introduced to the Manson family through a friend, and she initially fell for the idyllic free love lifestyle Manson promised. Unlike the others, she was new to the family when the murders took place, and her experience at Cielo Drive was profoundly traumatizing. Though she didn't physically participate in the killings, she was there, a witness to the horror. Her conscience ultimately led her to turn against Manson, and her testimony was crucial in putting him and his followers behind bars. These young men and women weren't born killers. They came from ordinary families, had childhood dreams, and at one point had futures that could have gone in any direction. But their paths crossed with Charles Manson, a man who knew how to exploit their vulnerabilities and turn them into weapons. The Manson family became a dark, twisted reflection of the era's desire for freedom and love, manipulated into acts of pure evil.
Who were Sharon Tate and the LaBiancas? Let's take a moment to get to know the victims whose lives were forever intertwined in one of the most brutal crime sprees in American history. Though they came from different backgrounds and led very different lives, both families were tragically united by this senseless violence that shattered the summer of 1969. First, we meet Sharon Tate, whose family's patriarch was Colonel Paul Tate, a career U.S. officer who served his country with pride and raised his family in discipline and tradition of the military lifestyle. He was a man who knew the meaning of sacrifice, often moving his wife Doris and their 3 daughters across the country and even overseas wherever his duty called. Despite the frequent relocations, the Tate family was close-knit. Doris, a loving, resilient mother, kept the home together with grace and a sense of warmth, providing stability for her girls. And then there was Sharon Tate, the eldest daughter, who would become one of Hollywood's most promising rising stars. She was born in Dallas, Texas, in 1943. Sharon's beauty was captivating, and it was clear from a young age that she had a rare magnetism. As a teenager, she began modeling and quickly caught the eye of talent scouts in the entertainment industry. By the mid-1960s, Sharon was making a name for herself in Hollywood, starring in films like Valley of the Dolls and The Fearless Vampire Killers, where she met her future husband, director Roman Polanski. Sharon's life seemed to shimmer with glamour and promise. Her marriage to Polanski was one of Hollywood's most talked-about unions, full of lavish parties and whirlwind romance. Yet, those who knew Sharon described her as more than just a Hollywood beauty. She was gentle, kind-hearted, and grounded despite her fame. By the summer of 1969, Sharon was 8.5 months pregnant, eagerly awaiting the birth of her first child. She and Roman were living in a rented home at 10,050 Cielo Drive in the hills of Los Angeles, a house that, unbeknownst to them, had a dark history of its own. It had once been the home of music producer Terry Melcher, who had crossed paths with Charles Manson, but more on that connection later. Now let's turn to the LaBiancas. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca lived on Waverly Drive in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles, and their story was the epitome of American success and hard work. Leno LaBianca was the son of Italian immigrants who had built a grocery empire in Southern California. He was a businessman for his tireless work ethic and dedication to his family's legacy. Yet beneath the hard exterior, Leno had a love for fine things. He enjoyed boating, horse racing, and spending time at the family's lake house. Friends described him as generous and a bit old-fashioned, the kind of man who took care of his loved ones and approached life with both seriousness and humor. Rosemary LaBianca was Leno's wife. She was equally remarkable. She had built her own successful career as the owner of a clothing boutique, and those who knew her said she had an eye for design and a knack for business. Rosemary had a vibrant spirit. She loved to travel and had a particular appreciation for beautiful things, from clothes to the serene nature of their lake property. Together, Leno and Rosemary seemed to have it all: a stable life built on years of hard work, a blended family from previous marriages, and a future full of possibilities. The LaBiancas' home on Waverly Drive was far from the glitz of Hollywood. It was a quiet, respectable neighborhood where they settled to enjoy the fruits of their labor. But even in their suburban tranquility, darkness found its way in, intersecting with the chaos that Manson and his followers unleashed upon Los Angeles. The stories of the Tates and the LaBiancas paint a picture of two families living ordinary, and in Sharon's case, extraordinary lives. Their paths were different, their circles never quite overlapping, until that fateful August weekend. For Sharon Tate, life was on the verge of a new beginning with a baby due any day. For the LaBiancas, life was rich and well-lived, full of plans and simple pleasures. None of them could have anticipated that their homes would become scenes of horror, that their names would be etched in history, not for the lives that they lived, but for the violence that they endured.
One of the most haunting misconceptions surrounding the brutal events of August 1969 is that the Tates and the LaBiancas knew each other or were connected in some way. The truth, however, is that these two families did not have any personal or social ties to one another. They lived in an entirely different world. Sharon Tate in the glitzy hills of Hollywood and Leno and Rosemary LaBianca in the quiet Los Feliz neighborhood. The tragic connection between them would only be made by the murderous rampage of Charles Manson's followers, whose crimes seemed almost random in their violence. The Tate murders and the LaBianca murders were not linked by any relationship between the victims, but rather by Manson's twisted vision and the geographical proximity of the crime scenes. To understand the events leading up to that horrific weekend, we need to look at each family's last moments, unconnected, yet forever bound by the bloodshed that would follow. On the night of August 8, 1969, at Cielo Drive, Sharon Tate was hosting a small gathering at her rented home at 10050 Cielo Drive. Roman Polanski, her husband, was away in Europe working on a film project, but Sharon was surrounded by close friends. The house had once belonged to music producer Terry Melker, and while it was now home to the young Hollywood starlet, it had the past that unwittingly tied it to Charles Manson. Manson had previously visited the home, hoping to jumpstart his music career with Melker's help, only to be rejected, a snub that festered in Manson's mind. But on this summer night, the shadow of Manson was far from the minds of those at Cielo Drive. Sharon was 8.5 months pregnant, glowing with the anticipation of becoming a mother. Her guests that evening were a close-knit circle: Jay Sebring, her ex-boyfriend and renowned celebrity hairstylist; Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folger coffee fortune; and Abigail's boyfriend, Yakovlevich Frakowski, a Polish actor and friend of Polanski. The mood was light, warm, and full of the quiet joy that comes from the simple pleasures of sharing time with friends. They had spent the evening together dining at their favorite local restaurant, El Coyote, before returning to the house. They laughed and shared stories, unaware that the serene beauty of the Hollywood hills around them would soon be shattered. Sharon, always described as gracious and loving, had been in a good mood, though exhausted from her pregnancy. Jay Sebring, who remained one of her dearest friends even after their romantic relationship ended, was protected and attentive. Abigail and Frakowski were in good spirits, though they had been dealing with the tensions of their relationship. It was in many ways an ordinary night with no hint of the impending terror. Meanwhile, on August 9, 1969, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were winding down from a long day. The LaBiancas had spent the afternoon at Lake Isabella, where they kept a vacation property. They had driven back to their home in Los Feliz to settle in for the night. They weren't hosting a glamorous gathering or expecting guests. They were simply a middle-aged couple returning to the comfort of their home after a relaxing weekend. Leno, the successful owner of a chain grocery store, was known for being a creature of habit. He liked his routines and the quiet of his suburban life. Rosemary, a successful entrepreneur in her own right, enjoyed the simple luxuries of a well-earned life. The couple had a blended family from their previous marriages, and their love for each other was evident in how they supported and built their life together. That evening was peaceful. The LaBiancas had made a stop to visit Rosemary's daughter, Susan, before finally making their way back to Waverly Drive. They likely felt safe as they pulled into the driveway of their Spanish-style home, tucked away in the quiet hills. It was a neighborhood where neighbors waved at each other, where life moved at a more relaxed pace. Leno and Rosemary had no reason to suspect that their lives were about to be brutally and irrevocably changed. What's most chilling is that there was no connection between the families themselves. They didn't know each other, had never crossed paths, and had no shared acquaintances. The horror that linked them was entirely orchestrated by Charles Manson. After ordering his followers to commit murder at the Tate residence on August 8th, Manson sought to continue the mayhem the following night. He chose the LaBianca home at random, possibly influenced by the familiarity with the neighborhood from previous drives through Los Feliz. So while there was no shared history or bond between the Tates and the LaBiancas, both families became unwilling characters in Manson's chaotic narrative. They were victims, caught in the crossfire of a madman's desire to incite fear and start an apocalyptic race war he called Helter-Skelter. It was a senseless, horrific coincidence, a reminder of how random and unthinkable violence can connect even the most unrelated lives. The night before the murderers was full of ordinary human moments. Friends laughing over dinner, a couple returning home from a peaceful day on the lake. Those moments, now frozen in time, became a tragic prelude to a weekend of unimaginable horror, one that would forever scar the American conscience.
The summer of '69 was one of contradictions. Love and peace mingled with the undercurrents of unrest and rebellion. While Woodstock and the moon landing inspired hope, darkness lurked in other corners. For most, that summer was about freedom and possibility. Yet, for a small, fanatical group, it marked the start of a warped vision. Charles Manson had spent months indoctrinating his followers with an ideology that he believed would reshape society. With chilling precision, he twisted messages of counterculture rebellion into calls for chaos, planting seeds that would become a horrifying weekend. August 8th was a warm, ordinary evening in Los Angeles, but Manson was poised to disrupt the illusion of safety many felt. As his followers prepared to carry out his orders, they were not just enacting violence, but setting in motion an attack on innocence itself. The unsuspecting residents of Cielo Drive and the LaBianca home were bound by their proximity and Manson's deluded ambitions. Manson had fabricated connections in his mind, connections that justified his cruelty. But in reality, these victims were ordinary people, strangers to Manson and each other, whose lives were about to intersect in blood. The events at Cielo Drive and the LaBianca residence were not just acts of murder, but carefully orchestrated symbols of Manson's grand, destructive narrative. His so-called Helter-Skelter plan was beginning, and he sent his followers into the night. They carried not just weapons, but a mission designed to upend society. Through drugs, manipulation, and isolation, Manson had convinced his followers that this twisted ideology was a holy cause, and his word was their law. The next 2 nights would etch themselves into American consciousness, forever staining that summer of optimism with fear. The tragedy of these murders was not only in their brutality, but in the realization that such violence could erupt anywhere without warning under the influence of a single man's vision. These senseless murders laid bare the darker side of an era, a reminder that even in times of peace, there are forces of chaos waiting to strike.
What was the driving force behind these murders? Manson's delusion revolved around what he called helter-skelter, a term he borrowed from the Beatles' White Album. He believed the race war was imminent, an apocalyptic event where black people would rise up and overthrow white society. In Manson's twisted vision, he and his followers will hide out in the desert during the chaos and then emerge to lead the survivors. The murders were intended to ignite this war, with Manson hoping brutality would be blamed on black militants, thus kickstarting the violent revolution he craved. His followers didn't question his madness. Manson had primed them for obedience through classic cult tactics, isolation, psychological manipulation, and love bombing. He stripped away their identities and rebuilt them in his image, convincing them that he was a messiah and that his word was law. They were conditioned to believe that they were part of something larger, something divine, and the murder was merely a necessary step in fulfilling Manson's prophecy. How did Manson gain such control? It started with love and attention. He offered his followers the sense of belonging they were desperate for, but he quickly turned to psychological domination. He'd conduct trials where family members were humiliated and broken down, only to be built back up in Manson's image. He used drugs, sleep deprivation, and emotional manipulation, creating a trauma bond that made his followers feel they couldn't survive without him. Manson positioned himself as a father figure, a prophet, even a god, and in the world of Manson's family, There was no room for dissent. Questioning Manson's teachings was unthinkable. His vision was absolute, and his followers had been conditioned to obey without hesitation. Cults have a way of making the unimaginable seem inevitable. Manson had created a self-contained world where his apocalyptic beliefs were gospel, seen as a holy mission. By the time August 1969 arrived, his followers were more than willing to kill for him. They had been primed, conditioned, and broken down, ready to do whatever Manson asked, no matter how horrific the task.
The investigation into the Tate-LaBianca murders was a complex puzzle, and in the beginning, the pieces seemed hopelessly scattered. When the murders first occurred in August of 1969, the Los Angeles Police Department had no idea that they were dealing with two sets of killings committed by the same group. The brutality of both of these scenes was undeniable, but any concrete leads felt elusive. At the Cielo Drive home, where Sharon Tate and her friends had been slaughtered, the scene was a nightmare. Blood was everywhere, splashed on the walls, the front porch, and even smeared in letters, spelling out the word pig on the front door. The victims' bodies were left in gruesome poses, and there were multiple murder weapons involved. The sheer savagery stunned investigators, but they were left without any obvious suspects. Over at the LaBianca house, the following night's carnage showed similar brutality. Leno Bianca had a carving fork protruding from his stomach, and "Death to Pigs" had been scrawled on the walls in blood. But the murders seemed so random, so senseless, and no one immediately thought to connect them. The police had to chase down leads that went nowhere. At first, they suspected that the Tate murders were drug-related. Sharon Tate's friend, Wojciech Frykowski, had been known to use drugs, and Abigail Folger was wealthy and might have had connections in that world. But none of those theories panned out. Meanwhile, the LaBianca case seemed like a home invasion gone terribly wrong, with no clear link to the horror on Cielo Drive. It seemed like the case was slipping away, but then slowly, a series of small breaks began to change everything. The real breakthrough came from an unexpected source, one of Manson's own followers. Susan Atkins, who had participated in the Tate murders, had been arrested in October 1969 for her role in an unrelated crime, the murder of Gary Hinman, a musician who had been killed in July of that year. While in custody, Atkins couldn't keep quiet about the atrocity she had witnessed and committed. She had boasted to her cellmates at the Sybil Brand Institute for Women, describing the horrifying details of the Tate murders with a chilling lack of remorse. It was so easy, she reportedly bragged. She told her cellmates about stabbing Sharon Tate, who had pleaded for the life of her unborn child, and how they had left words written in blood as Manson had instructed. One of the women Atkins confided in was horrified and quickly informed authorities. The confession became the first concrete link tying the Manson family to the murders on Cielo Drive. When the LAPD received this information, they realized that a seemingly fringe group of hippies living on a dilapidated movie ranch could be responsible for one of the most notorious crimes in Los Angeles.
By that time, law enforcement was already familiar with the Manson family. Back in August 1969, shortly after the murderers, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department had raided Spahn Ranch, where Manson and his followers were living, under suspicion of auto theft. The group had been arrested, but because of a clerical error, many of them were released. The ranch, with its old Western movie set and creaky barns, had been a hotbed of strange activity, but until Atkins' confessions, the police had no idea they were housing murderers. With Atkins' statement in hand, the police returned to Spahn Ranch and started to piece together the gruesome puzzle. They discovered more details about the family's cult dynamics and Manson's apocalyptic teachings. Members began to crack under pressure, and as the investigation widened, the horrifying pictures came into focus. Once the police knew that Manson's followers had committed the Tate murders, it wasn't long before they connected them to the LaBianca's killings as well. Similarities in the bloody messages left at both crime scenes provided strong evidence that the same group was involved. Additionally, Manson's habit of driving around Los Angeles looking for pigs to kill as part of his twisted Helter-Skelter prophecy helped link the two nights of terror. Linda Kasabian, another member of the family who had been present during both sets of murderers but didn't partake in the violence, became a key witness. She turned herself in and agreed to cooperate with the prosecution. Her detailed testimony painted a clear picture of the events of those 2 nights, describing how Manson had ordered the killings to incite chaos and bring about the race war he envisioned. The arrest of Charles Manson and his followers sent shockwaves through the nation. This wasn't just a story about a cult. It was about how a man could bend others to his will, turning them into instruments of violence. The trials that followed was as much about Manson's hold over his followers as it was about the murderers themselves. In the end, it was the confessions, witness testimonies, and the mountain of circumstantial evidence that brought Manson and his family to justice. In the years since, the investigation has been analyzed, dissected, and debated. But one thing remains clear: the sheer randomness of the murderers coupled with Manson's ability to manipulate others created a legacy of fear and fascination that continues to captivate the public till this day.
Charles Manson's arrest on December 1st, 1969, was almost anticlimactic, considering the chaos he had unleashed across Los Angeles. It wasn't even for the murders that he and his followers had committed, but rather for unrelated charges of auto theft and arson. Yet, as the investigators began connecting the dots between the brutal Tate LaBianca murders and the small, scruffy man leading a group of devoted, glassy-eyed followers, Manson's name became synonymous with terror. The capture of Manson and several of his followers at Spahn Ranch marked the beginning of one of the most bizarre and riveting trials in American history. By the time Manson and his co-defendants walked into the courtroom in June of 1970, the nation was watching with horrified fascination. The trial was like a grotesque theater production, with Manson as the deranged director. He entered the courtroom with a wild confidence, flashing a carved X on his forehead, a mark he later transformed into a swastika, a grotesque symbol of his rejection of society. His behavior was erratic and often frightening. He would laugh at inappropriate moments, hurl insults at the judge, and at times speak in riddles that reflected the twisted logic of his apocalyptic beliefs. One of the trial's most shocking moments came when Manson lunged at Judge Charles Older, shouting, "In the name of Christian justice, someone should cut your head off." Court security quickly subdued him, but the message was clear. Charles Manson wasn't just dangerous, he was unpredictable and terrifying. His female co-defendants, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, mirrored his behavior, demonstrating the complete psychological control he had over them. They would giggle, chant, and even carve the same X into their foreheads in solidarity with Manson. The sight of these young women who had been transformed into killers under Manson's spell disturbed the nation, and rightfully so. They were a haunting reminder of how easily someone could be manipulated into committing unspeakable acts. The trial dragged on for months, and the public was glued to every development. Each day brought new revelations about Manson's philosophies, the murders, and the cult-like obedience of his followers. Manson's defense strategy was as unhinged as his behavior. He claimed to be a scapegoat, a man persecuted for trying to save the world. That sounds familiar. His attorney, Ronald Hughes, who would mysteriously disappear and later be found dead under suspicious circumstances, struggled to control the courtroom chaos. At one point, Manson tried to testify but was silenced by the judge who declared him unfit. The entire spectacle was like a nightmare unfolding in real time, a front-row seat to the mind of a madman.
The media coverage was relentless. Manson's face, with his wild eyes and scruffy beard, became a fixture on television screens and newspapers across the country. Reporters dissected every aspect of his life, from his time in prison to his strange apocalyptic beliefs, and the word cult became a regular part of the American lexicon. The nation was captivated by the story of how a man could wield such control over his followers, leading them to commit some of the most horrific crimes imaginable. Journalists painted Manson as a master manipulator, a man who preyed on the vulnerable and twisted their minds to serve his dark prophetic vision. In the era where trust in traditional institutions was already eroding, Manson's story tapped into the fears about the counterculture movement and the supposed dangers of free love and communal living. He was the ultimate boogeyman, symbol of how an idealistic search for peace could descend into violence and madness. The media circus surrounding Manson's trial drew comparisons to other high-profile stories of the time, including the sensational coverage of Scientology. Like Manson, Scientology had a polarizing effect on the public. Its founder, L. Ron Hubbard, was often portrayed as a cult-like figure, and the church's secretive practices and aggressive tactics were widely reported. The coverage of Manson's trial highlighted America's fascination and fear of charismatic leaders who would warp the minds of their followers. Both stories reflect the country's broader anxieties about manipulation, mind control, and the power of belief.
The architect of chaos. Charles Manson, the man at the center of it all, was convicted on January 25, 1971. After 9 days of deliberation, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder for his role in orchestrating the killings. Though he did not physically commit the murders, Manson's iron grip on his followers and his orders led to the gruesome deaths of Sharon Tate, her unborn child, and 6 others. Manson was sentenced to death, but this was later commuted to life in prison when California abolished the death penalty in 1972. Manson spent the rest of his life in prison, a figure of both horror and morbid fascination. He was denied parole repeatedly, most recently in 2012, due to his lack of remorse and continued behavioral issues. Manson died of natural causes on November 19, 2017, at the age of 83 while incarcerated at Corcoran State Prison in California. His death marked the end of an era, yet the shadow he cast remained as unsettling as ever. The most feared member, Susan Atkins, often regarded as the most chilling of Manson's followers, participated in the Tate murders and infamously admitted to stabbing Sharon Tate while the actress begged for the life of her unborn child. Atkins was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, a sentence that was also reduced to life in prison in 1972. Over the decades, Atkins became a born-again Christian and expressed remorse for her actions. Despite her appeals for compassionate release due to terminal brain cancer, the parole board denied her request. Susan Atkins died on September 24, 2009, at the age of 61, after spending nearly 4 decades in prison. The loyal accomplice, Patricia Krenwinkel, known as Katie within the family, was deeply involved in both the Tate and LaBianca murders. Her conviction included first-degree murder with conspiracy to commit murder, resulting in the same death sentence that was later converted to life imprisonment. Krenwinkel holds the dubious distinction of being California's longest-serving female inmate. During her time behind bars, she earned a degree and became involved in prison programs advocating for domestic violence survivors. Krenwinkel's repeated parole bids were denied, with the latest refusal in 2022 due to concerns over her past actions and potential threat to public safety. As of now, she remains incarcerated in the California Institution for Women, the youngest of the family. Leslie Van Houten was just 19 years old when she took part in the brutal murder of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. Unlike the others, Van Houten was not present during the Tate murders, but was convicted of first-degree murder for her role in the LaBianca killings. Her initial sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and she was granted parole multiple times, only for the decisions to be overturned by various California governors. In 2023, after decades of legal battles and numerous parole hearings, Van Houten was released on parole at the age of 73. Her release was controversial, sparking debates on justice, redemption, and whether former cult members can ever fully atone for their crimes. The Enforcer. Charles Tex Watson, Manson's right-hand man and muscle behind the horrific crimes, was deeply involved with both the Tate and LaBianca murders. He was convicted of 7 counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, and like the others, his initial death sentence was converted to life imprisonment. Watson became a born-again Christian and ordained minister while in prison, even authoring a book and establishing a prison ministry. Despite his religious conversion, Watson's numerous parole applications have all been denied. He remains incarcerated at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego, California. The reluctant witness. Linda Kasabian was present at the Tate murders but did not participate in the killings. Instead, she served as a lookout and later fled the scene, haunted by what she had witnessed. Kasabian turned herself in and became the star witness for the prosecution, providing crucial testimony that helped convict Manson and the others. In exchange for her cooperation, she was granted immunity and did not serve time for the murders. Kasabian changed her name and led a quiet, reclusive life away from the public eye. She passed away in 2023 at the age of 73, closing the chapter on one of the most pivotal figures who helped bring justice to the victims. The trial may have ended, but Manson's influence lingered like a dark cloud. People have continued to analyze how he managed to convince ordinary young men and women to kill, and what it says about the vulnerability of the human psyche. The Manson trial was more than a courtroom drama. It was a cultural reckoning. It forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about the allure of charismatic leaders and the fragility of the human mind. And as Manson was led away, ranting about the end of the world and how society was to blame, it became clear that his legacy would endure, not just in the crimes that he orchestrated, but in the haunting realization that anyone, given the right circumstances and a persuasive enough voice, could be led astray.
Charles Manson remains one of the most infamous figures in American history, a name forever associated with horror, madness, and the chilling reality of what one person's charisma and twisted vision can achieve. His impact as a cult leader goes far beyond the gruesome details of the Tate LaBiancas murders. Manson manipulated young and personable people, turning them into killers by exploiting their vulnerabilities and feeding them a toxic mix of love, fear, and apocalyptic prophecy he called Helter-Skelter. What makes Manson's story even more unsettling is his brief but notable connection to Scientology. While serving time in prison in the early 1960s, Manson reportedly spent hours engaging in Scientology practices, including auditing sessions. Though he eventually dismissed Scientology as inadequate for his grand ambition, it's hard to ignore how certain psychological techniques he learned may have informed his own manipulative strategies. He used methods that mirror those found in many high control groups, breaking down individuals' entities, isolating them from their loved one, and remodeling them into devoted followers who would do anything for him, even commit murders. As we look back on the terror that Manson unleashed, it serves as a grim reminder of the power of the human mind and how easily it can be twisted by a charismatic, controlling figure. It's a sombering thought, but one worth reflecting on. Cult leaders like Manson prey on the lonely, the lost, and the idealistic, offering a sense of belonging that in reality comes at an unimaginable cost. So what can we learn from this dark chapter in history? We encourage you, our listeners, to think critically about the psychological techniques used by cults in high control groups. These tactics, whenever employed by a man like Manson or an organized entity, can be subtle, insidious, and devastatingly effective. Recognizing the signs of manipulation and understanding how even the most intelligent and well-meaning people can be drawn in is a crucial first step in protecting oneself and our loved ones. It's a conversation worth having, not just as a way to look back at the past, but as a way to safeguard the future. As we continue to explore the shadowy intersection between cult behavior and true crime, our next episode will bridge this world with another story that blends both horror and fascination. As our channel evolves into Sinners and Secrets, with new look and broader true crime topics, we'll be diving into a case that, while unrelated to Manson, shares eerie similarities in the way psychological manipulations can lead to tragic and violent outcomes. It's a story that highlights how easily people can fall under the influence of a magnetic leader and the ripple effects that follows. I am Abraham Ulrich, and along with my co-host Sandy McKenna, thank you for listening, liking, commenting, and subscribing to Sinners and Secrets. Stay tuned and remember, the line between influence and control is thinner than we'd like to believe. Until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, and may your journey be as rich and enlightening as the stories you encounter.